Hello and welcome to Tech Deals graphics card performance comparison. Today we are testing three different graphics cards. The AMD RX 580 8GB card, the GTX 1070, and the GTX 1080. Links to all three cards in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg, as well as to the full build video on the computer that these cards are installed in. We are testing today on the $1,500 i7 7700K build. It is running at a fixed overclock of 4.7 GHz, 16 GB of DDR4 3200 is installed. Check that computer out in the link below. Fraps was used for the game performance numbers you will see in the charts at the end of this video. It was not used to capture the video you're watching. Instead, an external Elgato HD60X capture card was used for the video. There is no performance loss since the computer doesn't even know it was being recorded. The numbers in the upper left-hand corner are for MSI Afterburner, a free tool you can download to get real-time information on what your computer, your graphics card, CPU, and system memory are doing in real time while you're playing. First up, we have the RX 580, and not just any RX 580, this is the Gigabyte Aurorus. It is a factory overclock card, large oversized 100mm fans, RGB lighting, 1425 MHz clock speed out of the box, nearly a 100 MHz factory overclock, and it will overclock further. I have had this card to 1500 MHz, however, to keep it stable there, the fan speed did have to be manually increased, and it does become marginally audible at that point. Rather than doing that, I left it at the default factory settings because it is a completely silent card. Look at the fan speed, we're at 1000 RPM, these fans are just loafing along doing nothing. This computer was 2 feet away from me on top of my desk while I was testing. The video card is completely silent. In fact, the case fans, the liquid cooler on the CPU is far noisier than this graphics card is. Now, one of the first questions that's bound to come up is, why in the world are you testing an RX 580 against a 1070 and a 1080? Well, quite simply, I want to see whether or not the 580 still cuts it for ultra level detail at 1080p, and is the extra money for a 1070 or a 1080 worth it? Now, currently in the beginning of May 2017, when I'm filming this video, the RX 580 is the best graphics card that AMD sells. There is an upcoming card that's currently called Vega, which will be released sometime in 2017. We have no information on it. It's supposed to be faster than this. It is not going to be a replacement for the RX 580. It's designed to be a step up in performance, providing more performance at a higher price point than the RX 580. So if you have about a $250 budget, the RX 580 is likely still going to be the card you're going to buy, even after Vega launches. Vega is probably going to be more in the $300 to $400 price range. Now, briefly, I will talk about them in detail, but the GTX 1070 and 1080 have come down in price substantially since they launched last year. The 1070 was really a $450 card when it launched last year, and the GTX 1080 was really a $650 card. Yes, they were supposed to be a little less than that, but that's the reality of what they really cost. At the time when they came out, the 1070 was sort of the very nice mainstream 1440p gaming card, with the 1080 the ultimate 1440p gaming card, or a makeshift or workable 4K gaming card. Although it never was great at it, it certainly did the job as best it could, since frankly it was the best you could buy, short of going to the $1,200 Titan XP. But now the GTX 1070 is available for under $350, and the GTX 1080 is now available for under $500. These are two new price points. It has brought that level of performance down to a lower price. One of the reasons for the comparison is this RX 580 that I'm testing here is over $250. There is less than a $100 price difference between these cards. The question is, from a dollars to performance point of view, from a frames per second per dollar spent, is the RX 580, GTX 1070, or even the GTX 1080 a better value for the money? Now, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the specific performance of the RX 580. We are at 1080p resolution. We are at the Ultra Detail preset. in Ghost Recon Wildlands. This game is absolutely gorgeous in ultra detail, but it is punishing in performance. Now, I'm not doing anything at the moment except picking up random supplies and picking up, there's a skill point medal thing I picked up, and we're currently bouncing around between 40 and 60 frames per second. Now, that's not bad, but nothing's going on yet. Wait till the firefights start. It is going to drop from there. Now, in terms of graphics card usage, we are completely and totally graphics card limited. Take a look at our GPU usage up there, 100%. The graphics card's running at 72 degrees Celsius, and you can see the chip's power draw at just around 120 watts of power. It's really not that bad. This card has an 8-pin and a 6-pin PCI Express power connector, and even taking into account the fact that the whole card itself is probably drawing more than even that's indicating, the 300 total watts available to it between the two power connectors and the motherboard is frankly extreme overkill, so you will have no power delivery issues on this card whatsoever. Then the fan speed is turning at 34%. I mentioned before this thing's loafing on at about 1000 RPM. These are 100mm fans. They are absolutely silent. This card really makes basically no audible. I suppose if you put your ear right next to it, it might have a whisper sound. It really is quiet. Now, the clock speed, as I mentioned before, is 1425 megahertz. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the second fastest RX 580 in terms of shipping speed. The very fastest card is a Sapphire Nitro Plus limited edition card, and it's a limited edition. I don't know that it's actually going to continue to be sold, so I'm not covering it simply because it's a little faster at 1450. The 25 megahertz difference makes no difference. That is such a trivially small percentage difference, I wouldn't sweat it. This card will be available on an ongoing basis and is basically the fastest normal RX 580 you can buy. Let's take a look at our VRAM usage. Now, the VRAM usage at Ultra is higher, or at least the allocated RAM is higher. We are at about 5.5 gigabytes of VRAM. If you watch the video where I compared the GTX 1060 to the RX 580, that was done at high detail. That was using 4 gigs of VRAM. So Ultra is using about 1.4, 1.5 gigabytes of VRAM more than that was. However, that's fine. You're not going to be playing Ultra on a 2 or 3 or even 4 gigabyte card, or you shouldn't be. It isn't going to have the performance you need. Now, you can see here, if you look, I'm going to skip ahead down to the bottom line since we're about to go on a chase and we're engaging in combat. Look at this, we're at 44, 45 frames per second. Is it playable? Yes. But there are moments where it's a little bit laggy. The input controls are not as good as they are when the game's at 60 frames per second, especially in a game with a lot of combat and running around and dodging fire and different faction forces and driving mechanics. Ooh, that was a nice explosion. We had to dip down to 40 frames per second there. This is not a game where you want your frame rate to be unstable and slow. Now, as a side note, I did test very high detail on this card. It is a noticeable improvement in performance. And frankly, let me just tell you up front, my recommendation, if you are going to buy an RX 580 and you want something nicer looking than high detail, very high is doable. It is slower, of course, than high is, but it is closer to high performance than it is to ultra. This can be, look at that, we dropped down to 37 frames per second. Now, some of you may be saying, oh, that's not too bad. TV's at 30 frames a second. I could play a game at 30 frames per second. You could. If the game was locked and designed to run at 30 frames per second and the input controls were all designed for 30 frames per second, sure. There absolutely are games that are not an issue at 30 FPS. This is not one of them. The slower the performance got, the slower the frame rate got, the harder it got to control. It is easier to play this game at 60 than it is at 30. Now, I've shown you just over 9 minutes of gameplay on the RX 580. Let's transition to the GTX 1070 now. This card is the Gigabyte G1 Gaming. It's a very nice mid-level 1070 card that I have covered in my Which GTX 1070 Should You Buy video. 3 fans, very low noise profile, and it is a good overclocking card. The clock speed, if you look on the real-time MSI Afterburner numbers up there, is just over 2 gigahertz on this card. Please note that that is not what GPU Boost 3.0 put this card to. It was closer to 1900 megahertz, which is a little on the low side for GPU Boost. Now, NVIDIA's automatic overclocking will overclock each card a little bit differently, and most importantly, sometimes differently from game to game. I've even found reloading the same game in a different detail setting will sometimes produce a different GPU overclocking speed. Now, why am I telling you all this? Two reasons. Number one, this is manually overclocked a bit further. I wanted to give this card a more realistic representation of what I've seen on my other cards. I usually play with my EVGA For the Win and the For the Win 2 1070 cards. Those are the two cards installed in my personal machine, and those run at nearly 2 gigahertz out of the box with GPU Boost 3.0. This one's a little bit on the low side. Now, the fan speed that you see up there is automatically set. I did not crank the fan speed up. It's that plus 115 overclock in MSI Afterburner that sort of kicked the fan speed up, but it's still very, very quiet. Do not let a number make you think that it's loud. If it was loud, I would tell you. If it made a hum or a noise, sure, no worries, I'll tell you. It didn't, which surprises me actually, because at nearly 2,000 RPM, those fans were still very, very quiet. Kudos to Gigabyte for making silent fans. Now, the second reason I'm telling you this is quite simply if you have a 10 series NVIDIA card and you watch my benchmarks or any other benchmarks and go, gee, I don't think I'm getting that level of performance. You might not be, because your GPU Boost, for whatever reason, your case size, your power supply, your cooling, is not allowing it to auto overclock to the same level. Most of these cards are several hundred megahertz slower out of the box per their factory speeds. Even the factory overclock cards, you need that GPU Boost running to get the clock speed up to the 2 gigahertz level. Every single one of my 10 series cards, 1060, 1070, and 1080, all run smoothly at default voltages at auto fan setting at 2 gigahertz. Please note that very few of them will run at 2.1. In fact, only 2 cards actually will run at 2.1 gigahertz, both of them For the Win cards, believe it or not. This card will not run at 2.1, the Zotac Mini will not run at 2.1, but most of the upper end cards should or will come really close. Now, the difference between 2 gigahertz, 2.05, and 2.1 is relatively small, but many of these cards come with a 1750 to 1800 megahertz clock speed out of the box, and if they are not boosting due to temperature or settings or something particular about your machine, that will be a noticeable deficit in performance. 1800 megahertz is 10% slower than 2 gigahertz, and that is a noticeable difference in performance. When it comes down to picking between these cards to buy, you essentially have two choices. Buy the least expensive card you can find, or buy one of the nicest looking, fanciest RGB cards with big fans and big heat sinks because you want to overclock it to the max. Now, sometimes you can get a bargain and buy somewhere in the middle and get one of the nicer cards. From time to time, you'll find the For the Win card or the MSI Gaming X or the Gigabyte Aurora's card, which is the one above the G1 Gaming, bigger fans, bigger heat sink. You'll find one of those premium cards for a non-premium price. And if you do, well then by all means buy it. That's definitely a deal. Just as a simple example, my EVGA For the Win, which is an oversized, overpowered card, it will run at 2.1 gigahertz. My superclocked, my EVGA superclocked, which has smaller fans, smaller heatsink, and smaller power delivery, will not. Moving on to the performance, taking a look at our MSI Afterburner numbers, I want you to notice that our frame rate has already improved. Now, it's not miles and miles ahead in this particular situation, but I did play 2 hours between these 3 cards. There's a lot of gameplay that I'm cutting out simply because otherwise this would be a ridiculously long video. Raise your hands if you want to watch these 3 cards for 2 hours. First of all, I don't think I want to voice this over for 2 hours. And second of all, a lot of it is driving around between towns, clearing out random bad guys. What I would do is I would stop by the roadside groups of guys and pick up the supplies. If you've never played Ghost Recon Wildlands or you haven't played it much, one of the things that really changes the balance and difficulty of the game is picking up all the supply crates because it lets you level up your skills. When you drive by, in fact, look at the minimap down there on the bottom right of the screen. Do you see the orange glow on the bottom of it by the side of the road? That may very well be supplies. That is anywhere between 2 to 5 enemies standing on the side of the road guarding some supplies. They're basically put there to give you somebody to kill and something to do in between towns, and then you go over and pick up the supplies. It's often not a lot, between 50 and 200 supplies most of the time, which by comparison is not a lot because you can get up to 5,000 supplies by taking down convoys and doing main supply missions, but they add up. Drive down the road between towns and you might stop by 3 of them. If each one of them gives you 100, that's 300. Now, if you can get between 2,500 and 5,000 supplies by doing one main mission, is it worth picking up 300? If you pick up 300 between each town and then run around the towns after you've cleared them out. This town here, for example, once we've cleared this out of enemies, there will be more supply caches in there. 200 here, 50 there, 100 here. Pretty soon those numbers add up, and it's going to add up to multiple skill points. Those skill points make the drone that we're currently looking at last longer. In fact, what you're looking at here is the drone view, and I have the battery fully upgraded. When you first start, the drone only lasts for like less than a minute. I now have the drone fully upgraded, and it lasts indefinitely. I can leave it up in the air as long as I want. Furthermore, spotting ability. You gain better spotting. It more quickly picks up the enemies. You can upgrade the rebels' capabilities. You can upgrade your health. You can upgrade the vehicles you drive, the amount of damage you do to the enemies. You can upgrade the aircraft you fly. You can upgrade your squad mates, respawn time. You can upgrade the resuscitation time. If you get knocked out or the enemies get knocked out, how fast you can revive. There is a lot of upgrades that you can make, and each one of those 50, 100, and 200 supply crates that you tag on the side of the road works your way up the skill tree. As you move through the game to the harder difficulty levels and the harder areas where the enemies are more advanced and they start having helicopter gunships showing up, there will be benefits to having those upgrades. In fact, watch right here, there's going to be a mortar barrage coming in. That's rebel support. Cooldown time on that mortar barrage can be lowered. Not to 0, but it can be lowered. And then you can have a vehicles dropped off. So there's all kinds of things to do to enhance and change the nature of the game by picking up endless supply crates. Now, if that sounds like a lot of busy work, well, it is. Frankly, that's what fills out the hours and hours of gameplay. I now have dozens of hours of gameplay into this. This past weekend, or at least the past weekend before I did the voiceover of this, I played way too many hours of this game, including time that was not even benchmarking. I took a break for a day and just played a bunch of games, some with my kids, some playing this late at night, simply because there comes a point at where you need to actually play the game where you're not benchmarking and take those bloody numbers off the screen, because they do become distracting after a while. If you are an OCD person who likes to clear maps, who looks at the map and sees things left over and goes, ugh, it's not finished, I haven't done everything there is to do, this game will keep you busy for hundreds of hours. There might very well be 300 to 500 hours worth of stuff to do in this game. I've got dozens of hours into it, and I have taken down 1 lieutenant. Now, how many lieutenants are there? There's at least 24 of them. I actually haven't really quite counted how many there are. There's the main big boss. There's the 4 sub-bosses. There's, I think, 6 lieutenants underneath each sub-boss. There's various lieutenants to go after. There's all kinds of people besides the main boss to go after. And then there's endless side missions. In fact, this right here, you can see Mission Nearby Rebel Radio on the left-hand side of the screen in green. If you go do the rebel missions, that improves the rebels. If you do supply missions, that improves your skills and your squad. You can see rebel support down at the bottom. I'm dropping off an armored SUV. Where is it? There it is. How cool is it that you can just get an armored truck with a minigun on the roof dropped off wherever you need it? In fact, I'm hunted at the moment. I know this is turning into a game review, what can I say? To be completely honest, I try to find different things to talk about in each video. If all I did was read the MSI Afterburner numbers to you and talk about technical specs of stuff in every video, these would become tremendously boring very quickly. I'm trying not to make them boring. You'll have to give me feedback, thoughts, and comments as to what you really want to hear in these videos. More gameplay commentary, more technical talk, longer videos, shorter videos. Should I combine Let's Play and spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about specific missions in these videos, or should I keep it short, sweet, to the point of just benchmarking? My rationale and reasoning for including extra commentary, talk, and thought behind everything is it puts additional gameplay on video. There are timestamps in the video description below. If you get tired of looking at the 1070 and want to go see the 1080, you can click in the description below and go fast forward to that. But for those people who want to actually watch more time, they want to see more frame rate, more actual gameplay, and see how well it plays as I drive around, do missions, kill things, engage helicopters, I've got to put it on the screen because just talking about it doesn't actually show the game. And I run under the presumption that if you just wanted to look at benchmark charts, you'd go to a web page. That was a hitch right there. In fact, I'm glad I talked through that and left that in there. If you missed it, rewind about 10 seconds. There was a hitch where it dropped down to 30 frames per second, but it was like for less than a second, it was maybe 10, 15 frames worth, boom, and then it went right back. For what it's worth, I probably should take that footage and put it into something different, and I will test some of these cards on the upcoming Ryzen 5 build that I'm going to be publishing soon. That is what is missing from Ryzen replays, and that's what doesn't show up in benchmarks very well. When people ask, what's better, the Intel i7 or Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7? Well, the benchmarks are going to show you higher frame rates, higher maximums, higher minimums, and higher averages on the i7 than they will on the Ryzen chips. And some people look at those and go, well, across the board, clearly the Intel chips are faster. They are, but they hitch. Why? I don't know, but they do. Those hitches are exceedingly uncommon, virtually non-existent on the Ryzen chips. And that's why when I played this game for fun this past weekend, I played it on my Ryzen 7 machine, not my i7 machine, because those hitches don't tend to happen on the Ryzen processors. Now, this is an 8-thread, 4-core processor at 4.7 gigahertz. Look at our CPU usage. It's just under 50%. It shouldn't have any hitches, but it does. They are just rare enough that they don't show up in the benchmarks, but they're noticeable when you're playing. Still, in over 30 minutes of gameplay, it might have happened 3 times. So it's not a deal breaker. If you own an i7 and go, oh wait, what does this mean that I can't play my games now? Of course not. We're talking about like a half a second worth of a hitch in every 10 minutes of gameplay. But I noticed them. And if you care, well, hey, Ryzen doesn't do it, or at least I haven't noticed Ryzen doing it, but it really is a minor thing, all things considered. Moving on to the GTX 1080. Now this is my For the Win card, and it is overclocked to 2.1 gigahertz, and it runs very smooth and very stable at this speed. If you want to overclock your card to the max, this is the type of card to buy. Why is it worth it? 2.1 gigahertz, look at our fan speed, 1500 RPM. This card is absolutely completely silent relative to the rest of the computer, even at this fan speed, even at this clock speed. I really love the For the Win cards. They do cost a bit more, but they have a better power delivery system. The fans are physically larger, so you do need a decent sized case to hold them, but I have had phenomenal luck running my For the Wins at maximum speed. They are my fastest overclocking cards, and I do have a lot of these things. Really nice cards. If you've watched my videos for the past 6 months to a year and you've heard me talk about EVGAs and review a lot of EVGA stuff, there's a reason for that. I am a fan. So I wear my bias on my sleeve. That doesn't make the other cards bad. It's just a personal preference and what I've had good luck with. Now this mission we're doing right here is one of the Rebel support missions. We're going to get a Rebel upgrade by doing this. We have to activate this radio and then guard it for a period of time. The health counter for the radio is a bit blocked by the MSI Afterburner numbers. We've got, 2 minutes and 30 seconds that we have to guard this. There's going to be incoming enemies. Notice that I prepared the field before I activated it. I called in Rebel aid. I called in a diversion mission, which puts more Rebel. Look at all the green on the map. Look on the mini map on the bottom right. All that green is Rebel support. Because I've already been doing upgrades, you could call in a lot of help. I dropped in an armored SUV with a minigun. So as soon as I activated the radio, I jumped in the SUV, which gives me armor and protection, and basically puts my guy on the top with a minigun. And all those rebels are also going to engage Santa Blanca when they show up. That's going to make these relatively easy and straightforward. When you first start the game and you first try doing these missions and you have no rebel support at all, nobody to call, no armored SUV with a minigun, these can be quite challenging. But even when the bad guys show up with multiple vehicles and dozens of enemies, look at this, the minigun just chews them up. Boom! Hang on, wait for it. It's going to go there in a oh, and I got rammed by somebody that way. And they love ramming you. Look at that. But we killed them. Now our SUV is smoking, and that's because it does have a limit to the amount of damage it can take. It would have blown up already if I had not spent skill points that decreases the damage done to your own vehicle. Now how in the world that helicopter is taking minigun fire and staying in the air is beyond me, but he won't last much longer. Now he has rocket launchers or machine guns, and I'm actually driving forward and backward to try to throw his aim off, although he's still hitting me by quite a bit, and the helicopter went down. Just 55 seconds to go before we win this and get an upgrade to one of our abilities. So I'm just moving forward and back, letting my minigun do all the work. If that seems a bit like cheating, well, hey, in war there's winning and there's losing, and there's no such thing as cheating. Now, we are still engaged, and there are still enemies. In fact, you can see I just turned around, the minigun came, and that got, look, they just get wiped out. I mean, one or two of the Santa Blanca drug cartel members running around the corner when I'm in a armored vehicle with a minigun, well, they just made bad life choices. Tech deals, making drug cartel members regret their life choices, 2017. With just 16 seconds left, we're going to be just fine. There is another helicopter coming in, but between the rebels and my minigun, it doesn't stand a chance. In fact, it's going to die here in like 2 seconds, and I need to actually move my vehicle forward. One risky run, depending upon where you shoot them down, watch this. You don't want the helicopter to land on your head. Side mission complete, rebel mortar cooldown lowered. So basically I can call in mortar drops more often thanks to this mission, and each one you do lowers it by a few more seconds, and pretty soon you'll be raining death from above nearly endlessly. Side note, if anybody from Ubisoft is magically watching this, I have a suggestion for a downloadable content pack for this game. Allow you to play as a American agent who turns rogue and wants to set up your own drug cartel. Wipe out Santa Blanca, wipe out Unidad, and then take over the place and set up your own little fiefdom. You've got the troops, you've got the skills, you've got the rebels on your side who you can turn into your own organization. Basically, come to the dark side because we have cookies and it's more fun. Obviously, that would be horrible in real life, but hey, it's a game, so why not? Have some fun with it. Now, speaking of playing on the dark side, if you haven't seen the trailer for the upcoming Star Wars Battlefront 2 game that EA is launching in the end of 2017, we get to play on the Empire side, and it is going to have a single-player story mode and campaign. Oh, look at that, another free armored SUV with a minigun out of nowhere. That's fun. I am really glad that those vehicles actually just appear out of nowhere. While it's not very realistic to just have the vehicle poof out of nowhere, when I first saw that you would be able to call in rebel vehicles for a drop-off, my concern is that it would have like a 60 or 90 second timer, and you'd have to stand around and actually wait for the vehicle to drive up and rebels to hop out and hand the vehicle off to you, which is somewhat realistic, although waiting 5 minutes would be more realistic. But the problem is, at some point, don't waste my time. I'm playing a game to have fun. Yeah, we know somebody had to drive it up. Fine, we sat here for 5 minutes. Don't make me sit here for 5 minutes. Just poof it onto the road, let me jump in, and get on to the killing. 'Cause reasons. Now, if you have been watching the real-time performance numbers during all of this gameplay that I've been talking over as the game has been progressing, you'll notice something. Is there a performance difference jumping from a 1070 to a 1080? Of course there is. They wouldn't sell it otherwise, but it's actually a pretty good difference. Now, the average frame rate is still not going to be like 100 frames per second, but it is a noticeable jump over the 1070. How much so? Well, I'll show you in a minute when we look at the benchmark charts. But if you want to play all current games in 2017 at 1080p, ultra max detail, 60 frames per second, no compromise, yeah, you actually need a GTX 1080 now. The 1070 will mostly do it, most of the time, in most of the games, but not all of them, and it will dip below 60 frames per second at times. Hang on, we're going for a ride. This is kind of ridiculous. Wait for it. Ow! Shirt balls, that's going to hurt. Hey, thankfully it's not my armored SUV. Can we go down the whole mountain? Oh, ouch, boom. I'm glad we haven't upgraded this. I hope the guy on top of the truck doesn't mind. And down we go, down the mountain we go, going on a journey to the Shire. No, I shouldn't give up my day job to sing. Oh, another frame dip. That was 30 frames per second. That was like 5 or 10 frames. That was a momentary hitch. But you saw it there as we were loading the lower levels. It hitched again. That is not the graphics card. We have an overclocked 2.1 gigahertz 1080 running at 1080p. It's not the graphics card. It's the CPU. What can I say? Putting aside those hitches, take a look at our real-time frame rate. It's still dipping below 60 frames per second. Lord almighty. If you want to set VSync on ultra detail to 60 frames per second and you never, ever want it to dip below 60, two things have to be true. One, you have to buy a Ryzen processor because the Intel chips won't do it. An i7 7700K at 4.7 gigahertz fixed still hitches. Putting the CPU issue aside, you'd need a GTX 1080 Ti for $700. Lord almighty, that's a lot of money. If you want higher frame rates, if you want to maintain 60 frames per second minimum and you don't want to spend $700, you actually will have to turn the detail down a bit. Switch down to very high detail from ultra. Amazingly enough, this game crushes graphics cards. Good thing I enjoy playing it because I think this is going to be a good testing game for the next few months on a variety of different graphics cards that I'll be looking at. One of the upcoming videos that I'll have planned, and I already have the cards to do this test, is how does the various levels of cards compare to the previous generations. The 1080 Ti, for example, which I will have a video coming out shortly on, the 1080 Ti versus the 980 Ti versus the 780 Ti. And I've got very nice versions of those cards, including I managed to pick up a really good deal used on eBay of a 1080 Ti classified from EVGA, which is a really fancy card, and that was really expensive back in the day, but I got it for like $150 or whatever it was. It was really cheap, and at that price I was like, sure, why not? I'll use that and do a generational comparison of testing between the 7, 900, and 10 series cards. If you are an AMD fan, don't feel left out. I will be doing the same thing on the AMD side. Depending upon when Vega comes out, I might or might not wait for Vega, we'll see. But if not, I'll do RX 580 versus perhaps the 390, 290. And I have a very nice Sapphire 7970 HD from, I think those are 6 years ago, 2011 time frame. I'd have to look. It's around then. It's five or 6 years old, give or take. But I have one of those. And I want to see where does the performance fall off. How old of a card can you use on both the AMD and the NVIDIA side and still play games like this? Now, of course, those cards are not going to play at ultra detail. For one thing, they don't have the VRAM for it. We're using nearly 6 gigabytes of VRAM. And while games do allocate more VRAM than they need sometimes at ultra detail, I actually believe it in this game. The texture detail, the world look at the rocks in front of me, look at the grass. The textures are definitely very high res in this game, and a 3 or 4 gigabyte card is probably not going to run ultra detail very well. And of course, even putting aside the VRAM issues, they don't remotely have the horsepower to run ultra detail. Since I'm testing ultra detail here, what I will probably do is lower those back down to high detail, and instead I'll look at frame rate differences. The idea there is going to be to show two things. Number one, can you play at high detail modern games such as Ghost Recon Wildlands at 60 frames per second at high detail on a 3, 5, or even 6-year-old graphics card? And then finally, if you upgrade to a newer card but stay at high detail, can you get high refresh rate frame rates? Maybe you have a 1080p monitor, but it's 144 Hz. How much graphics card do you need to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at high detail at 144 Hz? Well, clearly at ultra detail, 144 is not going to happen. Even a 1080 Ti is not even going to come close to that. You would have to lower the detail. Will high detail do it? I don't know. We'll find out in that series of videos coming up soon. For now, let's take a look at the performance. Here we are with the first set of results. Hang on, there will be more. This is the frame rate for average, 1% minimum, and 0.1% minimum. First, look at the green bars. This is the average frame rate across an average of about 40 minutes of gameplay on each card. 43 frames per second on the RX 580, 62 frames per second on the GTX 1070, and 73 frames per second on the GTX 1080. Now, again, please note that both of the 1070 and 1080 cards were manually overclocked by a bit. However, that RX 580 is factory overclocked by quite a lot, and it takes a lot of fan speed to get it much higher than it currently is out of the box. I did not want to run it at 60% because it does become audible there. Let's get the first thing out of the way. Is there a substantial jump in performance from a RX 580 to a 1070? Oh, yes, there is. That's nearly 20 frames per second more. That takes it from slow and stuttering to eminently playable. How about the further leap to the GTX 1080? Well, it helps. We get another 11 frames per second on average, which at this level is a decent jump in performance, but it's not the same leap from the 580 to the 1070 as from the 1070 to the 1080, and it is a lot more money. Now, I'll talk about the cost-value equation here in a second with another slide, but first let me talk about the red bars and the blue bars. The red bars represent the 1% minimum, and the 0.1% minimum are the blue bars. Essentially what this means is rather than an absolute minimum, and if I used absolute minimums, then it would take just one frame in 40 minutes of gameplay to give you that number. And who cares? One frame in 40 minutes is a trivial number. Instead, 1% minimum represents the bottom 1% of the frames dropped out. So this is the frame rate you'll get 99% of the time. The blue bar takes that a step further and gives you the frame rate you'll get 99.9% of the time. Now on the RX 580, those two numbers are fairly close, 32 and 30 frames per second respectively. So 99% of the time, you'll have an average frame rate of at least 32 frames per second and an average of 43. Now, this doesn't mean that there's no frames below 32 or 30. There might be a handful, but we're talking maybe a dozen frames in 40 minutes, which is really no big deal. The jump up to the GTX 1070 shows a dramatic difference, 32 to 48 frames per second on the 1% minimum. The difference between having a minimum frame rate of 32 and 48 in a game like Ghost Recon Wildlands is everything. Now, you don't have to play at ultra detail. As I said earlier in the video, if you have an RX 580, don't set it to ultra, set it to high, or maybe very high. It'll be somewhere in the middle. What about the GTX 1080? That brings us up to almost 60 frames per second on the 1% minimum. So 99% of the time, you'll be at 54 frames per second or average. So the vast majority of time, you will in fact have a smooth 60 frame per second playable frame rate. But you'll spend a lot of money to get there because a 1080 is a substantial price jump over a 1070. This next frame I'm showing you is dollar cost per frame per second. Price of the card divided by the frame rate at each of the three levels, lower is better. We get a cost of $5.80 per frame per second on the RX 580 and $5.60 on the GTX 1070. The GTX 1070 is actually less expensive per frame at the moment when I did this video. Prices change all the time. The links to Newegg in the description below are the entire list of each of these three cards, pre-searched, pre-sorted, priced lowest to highest. So you can take the lowest price card or your favorite card in that list, take the cost the card currently is, simply divide it by the frame rate in the previous chart to come up with the cost per frame per second. Now, I have included on here the numbers for the 1% minimum and the 0.1% minimum. $7.80 for the 1% on the 580, $7.30 for the 1 frame per second on the 1070. What about the 1080? It is more expensive than both cards per frame per second. You are paying a premium as you run up the list for performance. $6.80 for the average, $9.30 for the 1% minimum. Do you care? Are you willing to pay a premium to get that extra performance? Now that's a personal choice, but if when you're watching this video those cards aren't $500, you find one for $450 or even $430, that's going to change the dollar equation and make them a better deal. Now, not everything is a cost per frame. You might simply say, I want more frame rate. I'm willing to pay $150 more to get my 1% minimum much closer to 60 frames a second because I want ultra detail, or I want my card to last longer. I want to get another year of use out of it, whereas the 1070 might have to be replaced a little bit sooner. Finally, I want to make one other point. I'm using the prices you see here on the screen, $250, $350, and $500. Now, when I shot this video, you could buy an RX 580 8GB card for under $250, but those are stock clocked cards at 1340 megahertz, and they may not reflect the performance you get here. They may not even overclock this high. At the $250 price point, you'll find RX 580s that are factory overclocked with big heat sinks and big coolers that will run this fast. What about the 1070? Now, the Gigabyte G1 Gaming that I'm showing in this video on the day I recorded this voiceover actually was more than $350. But the EVGA Superclock 1070 was below $350 on Amazon. Now, again, prices change all the time. But when I film this video, you can actually get a good GTX 1070 for under $350 that will overclock easily to 2 gigahertz. So the numbers get even better if you can find that deal. Finally, the EVGA for the Win card was available for $499 on Newegg on the day I filmed this video. If it's not when you're watching, fair enough, but it was when I was filming this video, which is why I left it at $500. That card was tested overclocked to 2.1, which is a lot. Most of them won't get there. You'll need something like a For the Win or a Zotac Amp Extreme or a Gigabyte Gaming X or one of the really top-end cards to get 2.1 gigahertz out of it. Finally, please leave me some feedback in the comment section below. This is the first time I've ever done a chart like this. Dollar cost per frame per second. I've never done this before. Let me know what you think. Useful, not useful? Leave me your comments below and I will be sure to read them. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below the video. Post your comments below the video. Check the links in the video description. The links to Amazon and Newegg will be for these 3 graphics cards. I would greatly appreciate it if you use those while shopping. It does make a difference. The link to buy Ghost Recon Wildlands is going to be down there to Amazon, Kingwin, and G2A. Those are also useful links. Finally, my Patreon link will be down there. Patreon is a way for you to contribute directly to the channel. It helps me stay unbiased and tell you what I really think. The more contributions I get from viewers like you, the more I'm able to buy and review stuff you really want to see, independent of manufacturer support. I would greatly appreciate anything you can contribute. Even $1 per month is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.